For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet, as usual. Not sure who you were expecting, but it is me again. My last podcast focused extensively on the flood of apostasy predicted in the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9:26. And today I'm going to discuss the timeline for the apostasy foreseen by Daniel, but also the Great Apostasy from the ancient Church of Jesus Christ in the meridian of time. The two apostasies overlap in time, and scholars frequently fail to distinguish one from the other. I'll do so today in this podcast and discuss the two separate timelines that are used to measure the two apostasies from the perspective of Daniel on the one hand, and from the perspective of John in the book of Revelation on the other hand. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 165 in my book that can be found on my website at unveilingjesuschrist.com. The 70 weeks prophecy is found at the end of Daniel chapter 9. In the chapters that follow, additional details relevant to the prophecy are given, including matters of history in the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire that I've discussed in prior podcasts. Chapter 12 is the concluding chapter in the book of Daniel, and it serves somewhat as a prologue for the visions that Daniel has seen and recorded up to that point. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 9, the Lord said, "Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the end of time." Close quote. In this verse, the directive for Daniel to go thy way is a statement telling Daniel that although he cannot understand what has been revealed, he needs to be at peace with the predictions concerning his people. So it's not a statement to the effect of, "Hey, get out of here," or "Get out of my face and stop pestering me about the Jews and your people and their return to Jerusalem." Instead, this verse is about the words being closed up and sealed to the end of time, which some scholars interpret to mean that Daniel's visions are closed to interpretation and cannot be understood until the time of their actual fulfillment. That was true in Daniel's day, perhaps, but now we live in the time of the end, and Daniel's visions can be understood by spiritually sensitive people with the benefit of historical hindsight and added insights from the book of Revelation, which are to be unfolded in the eyes of all people in these last days, according to the prophecies of Moroni in Ether chapter 4, verse 16. Now, Daniel chapter 12, verse 10 says, "The wise shall understand," which Bruce R. McConkie has interpreted saying, "These are the saints of the Most High, the ones of whom he said, and whoso treasureth up my word shall not be deceived. Even though they can read the signs of the times, they shall not know the precise time of his coming, as Daniel expressed it. None of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." Close quote. Daniel is not the only one who has said that the mysteries of God will be revealed at the end of times. Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, verses 32 through 34, states that, "Verily I say unto you, in that day when the Lord shall come, he shall reveal all things, things which have passed, and hidden things which no man knew, things of the earth by which it was made, and the purpose and the end thereof, things most precious, things that are above, and things that are beneath, things that are in the earth, and upon the earth, and in heaven." Close quote. Like so many things in the gospel, This era of revelation and increasing knowledge of the mysteries won't suddenly turn on like a light switch. The increasing revelation is like the light of the rising sun that continues to increase until we hit high noon at the second coming, when all things will be revealed. I've said this before, and I think it bears repeating, that the Lord expects us to understand the visions and prophecies of John in the book of Revelation during this era of increasing light and enlightenment. Revelation 1:3 confirms this, saying, "Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand." Now, I have to say that the Lord isn't playing some kind of a cat and mouse game with us, where he promises us blessings if we understand and follow the prophecies of John, even though, in a bait and switch manner, those blessings can never really be ours because we have no ability to understand the words of the prophecies by either John or Daniel. It's kind of like that old Charlie Brown cartoon where Lucy is holding the football for Charlie Brown to kick the football. And historically, she always pulls away the ball right at the last moment, so that as Charlie Brown tries to kick it, he misses it and he falls flat on his back. And despite all of her promises that she won't pull the ball away, of course, we know that she always does. Well, that's not the Lord. He's not doing that to us. When he holds the ball and promises that he will hold it so that we can understand the prophecies of both John and Daniel, he's not going to move it away at the last minute so that we truly can't understand. This is reaffirmed again in Revelation chapter 22, verse 10, which likewise says, "He saith unto me, Seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand." Notice how Daniel 10:12 indicates that his prophecies were sealed until the end of times, and in this verse, John is told that he must not seal the sayings of his prophecy, for the time is at hand. I think they're talking about the same thing. It's the time in which we now live, and neither the sayings of Daniel or John are sealed to those who are willing to try and understand the prophecies and apply them to ourselves in our day. With this in mind, it's clear that we live in a day when there has been an outpouring of God's Spirit upon all flesh, as predicted in the book of Joel, chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, saying, "It shall come to pass afterward, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions, and also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my Spirit." Close quote. The words of Joel, by way of emphasis, are repeated in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, saying, "It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams." Close quote. Joseph Fielding Smith has said these prophecies are already in the process of being fulfilled, saying, "The Lord has already commenced to pour out his Spirit upon all flesh, and we do find even now that the sons and daughters prophesy, the old men dream dreams, and the young men see visions." Now, my brethren and sisters, I am not going to confine this prophecy to the members of the church. The Lord said he would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh. Close quote. The outpouring of the Spirit on all flesh is one of the latter-day signs of the time, but Donald W. Perry adds this cautionary note, saying, "As we look at the signs of the times and try to understand Scripture, we need to be cautious. Even when we know prophecy, it is not possible to predict precisely how the future will unfold, for the Lord seldom gives us all the details of a future event." Close quote. Now, I agree with Brother Perry, but don't you hate it when people rain on our parade about what we know about the future? The bottom line is that we live in the day when it's possible to have a clear and correct interpretation of Daniel's prophetic timeline for the great apostasy mentioned as a flood in the 70 weeks prophecy and as discussed in more detail in Daniel chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. Albert Barnes explains this, saying, "Though the revelation was closed and all that the angel had designed to say had been said, he does, in the subsequent verses, throw out some suggestions as to the time or as to some important events which were to mark the termination of the wonders referred to. They are bare hints, however, the meaning of which was to be reserved until the time when the predictions would be accomplished, and they are not of such a nature that they can be supposed to have been furnished any additional light to Daniel or to have done anything to relieve the perplexity of his mind in the case." Close quote. So let's now turn our attention to the Great Apostasy that describes a period in the earth's history when there was a worldwide loss of truth and spiritual darkness. Daniel and John both describe this era as a flood that covers the whole world. The Great Apostasy universally affected all people in all the world, but the effects and duration were not the same among all people. We could say that the component parts of the universal Great Apostasy include: 1. The Christian apostasy on the Eastern Hemisphere that began as members of Christ's church fell away as described in John's letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor in Revelation 2 and 3. Second, we also have the Nephite apostasy that began in about 200 A.D. and was complete with their destruction in approximately 400 A.D., as described in the Book of Mormon. Third, we also have the Lost 10 Tribes apostasy that I discussed in my podcast from June 8th of 2025. Fourth, and finally, we have the Jewish Great Apostasy, described by Daniel in the 70 weeks prophecy as I discussed in my podcast from July 8th of 2025. The Great Apostasy is inclusive of all these component parts, such that during the universal apostasy there was no place in the world among any people where the truth of the gospel was authoritatively taught and administered. The apostasy lasted for many centuries after members of Christ's ancient church fell away until the restitution of all things, as described by Joseph Fielding Smith, saying, "It seems rather strange that the truth, which is so plainly written, showing an apostasy and a restoration of the gospel in the last days, would be so generally misunderstood. The Bible is filled with predictions of an universal apostasy and the need for a restoration, and that again the heavens would be opened and our eternal Father and his Son Jesus Christ would commune with prophets and establish the gospel on the earth." Close quote. Daniel, the Old Testament prophet, also talks about the flood of apostasies among the Jews in the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9:26. And then he defines the period of the Jewish great apostasy with precision in Daniel 12, verse 11, saying, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days." Close quote. This much misunderstood prophecy does not refer to the abomination that maketh desolate carried out by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC, as many suppose, and which I discussed in detail during my podcast on July 1st of 2025. The taking away of the daily sacrifice and the abomination spoken of in Daniel 12:11 refers to the Roman abomination of desolation in 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem as predicted by the Savior in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. I discussed this abomination of desolation most recently in my podcast on July 6 of 2025. Joseph Fielding McConkie connects the prophecy in Daniel 12:11 with the abomination of desolation in 70 AD, saying, "The desolation of abomination." The term is the same as abomination of desolation and the abomination that maketh desolate. The conditions of desolation born of abomination and wickedness, as spoken of by Daniel, are destined to occur twice. The first occurrence centered in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The second occurrence will be when these events repeat themselves in the last days. Close quote. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown makes the same connection and specifically states that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD is the starting point for Daniel's prophecy of the Jewish apostasy that then lasts 1290 days, saying, "The second epoch from which the 1290 days may be counted is the profanation of the temple by pagan Rome under Titus." That is in Daniel 9:26, after Christ's death. Close quote. Daniel consistently prophesies about the Jewish people and the temple in Jerusalem, so that in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, he uses 70 AD as the start date for the Jewish apostasy, or that part of the Great Apostasy that was specific to the Jewish people. Daniel identifies 70 AD as the start of the Jewish aspect of the Great Apostasy, but it's important to recall that this defining moment in history was also preceded by spiritual darkness that was growing among the Jews and among the Christians on the Eastern Hemisphere, and would continue to grow in the world generally among the Nephites and the lost 10 tribes. Daniel Galbraith speaks about the growing floodwaters of apostasy as an evolutionary process rather than a revolutionary process among the Christian church that is also contemporaneous among the Jews, who were then also in a state of apostasy and had been for a very long period of time. He said, even before AD 70, Christianity had cut many of its Jewish ties as its missionaries turned more toward Gentile towns and less toward Jerusalem. Yet wrenching apostasy, predicted by both Jesus and his apostles, began to afflict and finally to devastate the church. After 70, Jerusalem was no longer the exclusive capital of the Christian faith. Ironically, as its center of affairs gravitated increasingly toward Rome, Christianity became increasingly persecuted by the Roman Empire. By then, the Christian faith was no longer the receptacle of pure doctrine as taught by Christ. Apostles and prophets had died or were killed, and grievous wolves entered the church, not sparing the flock. Self-appointed leaders arose, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. Close quote. Using 70 AD as a bright line or milestone in the Jewish apostasy, Daniel predicted that this flood of apostasy among the Jews would continue for 1290 days. These are actually prophetic days of years that fall within the 2,000-year gap of time between the 69th and 70th weeks of years in Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, as I discussed in my podcast from July 8, 2025. So before we sink our teeth into the meaning of Daniel's predicted timeline for the Jewish apostasy of 1,290 years, let me point out what the 1,290 years do not mean. For example, some scholars suggest that the 1,290 years in Daniel 12:11 are the same as the time, times, and half, or 1260 prophetic days of years in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, and also in Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. But they can't explain the extra 30 days of years in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. John Walvoord illustrates this problem saying, the last half of the 70th seven of years is a time, times, and half a time. That's from Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 12:14, which is 3½ years. It is also designated as 42 months in Revelation 11:2 or 1260 days in Revelation 11:3. How then can the variance of 30 days, that is, 1290 compared with 1260, be explained? Some suggest that the 30 days will extend beyond the end of the tribulation, allowing for the judgment of Israel and the judgment of the nations. Another possibility is that the 1290 days will begin 30 days before the middle of the 70th seven of years, when the world ruler will set up the abomination that causeth desolation. The 1290 days could begin with an announcement about the abomination made 30 days before the abomination is introduced. Close quote. Now, if you're like me, all of these potential explanations seem to be lacking, and you feel less than satisfied that any of them are correct. Frankly, the 30 years difference between the 1260 years and the 1290 years cannot be harmonized because they don't describe the same events, which Daniel Whedon alludes to without telling us what these different events are, saying, Daniel's 1290 days and 1335 days could hardly both be identical with the time, times, and half a time, unless, as Dr. Terry holds, these differences may have been designed to suggest that the time, times, and dividing of a time could not be reckoned with mathematical accuracy. Close quote. Again, that's not exactly a satisfactory explanation. Peter Pett's commentary reflects the same sense of frustration that scholars feel because they can't reconcile the 1290 years of apostasy in Daniel 12:11 with the 1260 years used by Daniel and John the Revelator in other scriptures. Peter Pett says, certainly the number is a difficulty to all other interpretations. All attempts to trace it have failed, nor is it possible to see it as signifying 3½ years, for it represents 3½ years plus a month. And surely, if he had wanted us to understand it as 3½ years, he would have made it 1,260 days. Daniel nowhere speaks of 1,260 days. John in Revelation clearly did not see 1,290 days as signifying 3½ years, for when he wanted to indicate that length of time, he did use 1,260 days, confirming our doubt above. Close quote. Some scholars attempt to reconcile the 1,290 days of years after 70 A.D. as 1,260 actual days, with mathematical adjustments based on solar years rather than lunar years to arrive at the 1,290 days. Scholars with this particular mindset include well-respected people such as Albert Barnes, Kyle and Delitzsch, John Walton. Daniel Whedon uses a slightly different approach by adding 1 month of 30 days to the 1,260 days, similar to the way that we add 1 day to our calendar every 4 years during leap year. According to Daniel Whedon, this will give us the reconciliation we are looking for, saying, Behrman has pointed out, however, that if the intercalary month, which was reckoned by the Babylonians, and Hebrews at regular intervals be counted with the 3.5 years, the result is exactly 1,290 days. Close quote. Unfortunately, the idea of adding a leap month to 1,260 days is not the answer we're looking for. And at this point, you're probably starting to feel a little bit like my wife sometimes feels when we have gospel discussions and she just wants the answer to her query without all the blood, sweat, and tears. Now, coming from a background in the law, I feel compelled to employ the Socratic method, which is a common tool for teaching legal principles in law school. Strictly speaking, my podcasts don't really employ the Socratic method since we aren't together to engage in a lively debate that leads inevitably to the answer we're all looking for. However, if I simply give the answer, there would be no recognition of the fact that there are conflicting opinions about the meaning of the 1,290 days, and people, including those who are listening to this podcast, must study these things out and make up your own mind as to who and what is correct. So let's now add another layer of complexity to the 1,290 years in Daniel 12:11 before we get to the ultimate resolution of our debate going on today. Let's look at Daniel chapter 12, verse 12, together with Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. Taking the two verses together, they say, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,305 days." Close quote. The 1,335 days of years in Daniel chapter 12, verse 12, represents an additional 45 days of years, or years, beyond the 1,290 years in verse 11. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown attempts to explain both dates by connecting the 1,290 years and the 1,335 years from the Great Apostasy in Daniel chapter 12 with the 1,260 actual days of times and a half time, or 3.5 years, of the Great Tribulation at the second coming set forth in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, and also Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, by saying 1,290 days, a month beyond the times and a half. In Daniel 12:12, 45 days more are added, in all 1,335 days. Tregelles thinks Jesus at his coming will deliver the Jews. An interval elapses answering to the 30 days by which 1,290 exceeds the 1,260 of the times and a half, during which their consciences are awakened to repentance and faith in him. A second interval elapses, answering to the additional 45 days by which the 1,335 exceed the 1,290, in which Israel's outcasts are gathered, and then the united blessing takes place. Close quote. Now, there are several problems with this particular interpretation, not the least of which is that Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown are attempting to compare a time of the Great Apostasy that began with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD with something that's happening at the second coming. So it just doesn't add up. And further, to equate Daniel's 1,290 actual years of great apostasy after 70 AD with John's 1,260 actual days of the Great Tribulation, that is 3.5 actual years, just before the second coming, cannot be a correct interpretation. However, Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown do correctly recognize that a blessing will come to the survivors of the 1290 years after an additional 45 years. In other words, if you can survive the 1290 years and live another 45 years until 1335, you're going to be blessed. That's the essence of what Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown is saying. So let's see whether that's correct. Daniel and John the Revelator both provide a timeline for the Great Apostasy from separate perspectives. Daniel prophesies about the apostasy and oppression of the Jews for 1290 years, and John prophesies about the apostasy among all other people and nations for 1260 years. John's description of the Great Apostasy can be found in Revelation chapter 13, 5 through 7. From John's perspective, the Great Apostasy is a prophetic period of 42 months, which equates to 30 days times 42 months, which equals 3.5 years, or 1260 days of years. I'll discuss these verses in more detail when we get to my podcast on Revelation chapter 13. But now that we understand both perspectives, how do we harmonize John's 1260 days of years for the Great Apostasy in Revelation 13:5 with Daniel's 1290 days of years for the Great Apostasy in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11? This query has two very easy and straightforward answers. First, as I have mentioned before, Daniel and John are talking about two separate events involving separate groups, so we don't have to reconcile the 30-year difference between the two. Daniel's 1290-year prophecy relates to the flood of spiritual darkness and desolations among the apostate Jews as one part of the Great Apostasy, whereas John's 1260-year prophecy relates to the falling away of Christ's church and the loss of priesthood power as another part of the Great Apostasy. You have to have both in order for there to be complete apostasy. But keep in mind that when we talk about the universal loss of Christ's true doctrine and his priesthood authority, we have to consider his church in all parts of the world, including the ancient church in the eastern hemisphere, the church on the western hemisphere among the Nephites, and Christ's church among the lost 10 tribes. Joseph Fielding McConkie grapples with the loss of the church and priesthood authority both universally and worldwide among these groups, saying, no exact date can be given as to when the purity of the gospel and the authority of the priesthood were lost. In the Old World, it would have been after the death of the apostles and long before the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. The New World dispensation of the gospel, as recorded in the Book of Mormon, lasted for 400 years after the visit of Christ among the Nephites. Perhaps it lasted longer with them than among other of the lost tribes of Israel visited by the resurrected Christ, and perhaps not. We are without any knowledge to that effect. In any event, if we are going to lay claim to the fulfillment of the prophecies of a restoration of all things in the last days, we are bound to the position that these same things were universally lost. Close quote. So the 1290-day prophecy in Daniel 12 wasn't talking about the Nephites on the American continent, so why should we assume that the 1290 days somehow relates to the loss of priesthood among that people on that continent? We shouldn't make that assumption, since we're talking about entirely separate peoples and conditions of apostasy from different perspectives of the same larger event. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 5, John measures the Great Apostasy from the perspective of priesthood authority that was universally lost from the earth for 1260 years. Since we know that Christ's true church was restored in 1830, and God once again had legal administrators on earth exercised in the priesthood as of that date, we can work backwards to figure out when John's 1260-year timeline begins. In other words, if we work backwards from the known date of 1830, it must mean that the universal loss of priesthood occurred with the translation of the lost 10 tribes in approximately 570 AD. That is, if you take 1830, subtract 1260 years, that equals 570 AD. And I discussed this in my podcast in more detail on May 27th of 2025. Several LDS authors and scholars do this very same calculation, but don't connect all the dots as I've attempted to do in this podcast. J. Perry states, for example, that if we consider that the apostasy ended in 1820, when the silence of the heavens was broken during Joseph Smith's first vision, or in 1830, when the church was formally organized, then the 1260-year period began in AD 570 or 560. But we know that the world had plunged deep into apostasy centuries before that time. Close quote. The Apostle John Whitsoe also calculated the time backwards to say that priesthood ordinances were lost before 600 AD without connecting that loss of priesthood to the translation of the lost 10 tribes, saying, "At last, about 600 years after Christ, the gospel laws and ordinances had become so completely warped that it was as if the church had departed from the north." Now, if I can interject here, that sounds a lot like the translation of the lost 10 tribes, but he doesn't actually say that. He continues saying, "The authority of the priesthood no longer remained with the church. This was the Great Apostasy. From that time, universal darkness reigned upon the earth for many centuries." Close quote. Daniel's 1290-year timeline from 70 AD to 1360 AD seems confusing because history has shown that the flood of spiritual darkness on earth did not end in 1360 AD. In fact, the spiritual darkness didn't end fully until the full light of the gospel was restored, beginning with Joseph Smith's first vision in 1820. However, keep in mind that Daniel's timeline relates to the metaphorical flood in Daniel 9:26 from the 70 weeks prophecy that I discuss in my podcast on July 8th of 2025. Once we put together the metaphorical flood from Daniel 9:26 with the timeline in Daniel 12 verses 11 through 12, we can easily recognize that the predicted floodwaters rose for 1290 years after 70 AD. In other words, the flood of spiritual darkness and falsehood rose among the Jews and throughout the earth, candidly, as light and truth diminished. Bruce R. McConkie describes this process saying, "When the gospel sun went down almost 2 millennia ago, when the priesthood was taken away and the dreary dusk descended in the congregations that once had known light, when the light and truth no longer shone forth from heaven, and when those on earth no longer were taught and directed by apostles and prophets, then spiritual darkness reigned. Darkness covered the earth, and gross darkness the minds of the people. The Dark Ages had their beginning, and the light of heaven no longer dwelt in the hearts of those who profess to worship Him whose we are." Close quote. After 1290 years of increasing darkness in the time period we call the Dark Ages, the flood of spiritual darkness crested in 1360 AD like a flood of actual water that reaches its high water mark and then begins to recede. Now, I know something about flooding, although I don't consider myself to be an expert on the subject. I do know something, however, because I live with my family in the Delta area in Sacramento County, California, where three major watershed rivers converge. Now, when we got very heavy rains and flooding in the area, we always knew how bad the flooding would be around our property a couple of days in advance because we could track the upstream level of flooding. When the floodwaters crested or reached their high point upstream, we knew then how bad it was going to be when all that floodwater reached the delta a couple of days later. When the high water level reached the delta, it didn't just mean that the flood arrived and was gone in a moment. It just means that the water level had reached its highest and most damaging level, and then it began to recede slowly. That's the flood imagery that Daniel employs in the 70 weeks prophecy and in Daniel 12, verses 11 and 12. Joseph Smith describes how this flood imagery applies to the historical reality of the Dark Ages that crested at the time of the Renaissance and then began to recede, saying, the so-called Dark Ages came about through apostasy and rebellion and rejection of the plan of salvation revealed through the prophets of Israel. This deep spiritual darkness is always manifest in lands where the people have turned away from the Lord and rejected his servants. The Spirit of the Lord withdraws from men when they rebel, and when the spirit of Satan takes possession of them, and gross darkness enters their souls. Ignorance follows in the wake of rebellion, and the light of truth goes out when men turn from the guidance of heaven. This darkness, spiritually and mentally, reached its deepest shade shortly preceding the period known as the Renaissance, or revival of learning. Close quote. Thus, Daniel predicted that the period we call the Dark Ages, when there was this flood of worldwide spiritual darkness, would recede into the Renaissance, as further stated by George Q. Morris, saying, after what historians in general agreement have called the Dark Ages, when these doctrines were being crystallized into creeds and man-made churches were increasing, the dawn began to break. The first rays of light appeared with the development of human freedom and the enlightenment of the human mind in the Renaissance. Close quote. Bruce R. McConkie makes the same observation and notes that the timing for the start of the Renaissance coincides exactly with what Daniel tells us, saying, with the revival of learning and the rebirth in man's breast of a thirst for truth, the Dark Ages were doomed, beginning in the 14th century, that is the 1300s. The Lord began to prepare those social, educational, religious, economic, and governmental conditions under which he could more easily restore the gospel for the last time among men. The spirit of inspiration rested upon Wycliffe, Huss, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, Knox, and others, causing them to rebel against the religious evils of the day and seek to make the Bible and other truth available to all who would receive such. The age of Renaissance and Reformation were part of the Lord's program preparatory to ushering in his great latter-day work. Close quote. History proves the accuracy of Daniel's prediction that the flood of spiritual darkness that began in 70 A.D. crested with the onset of the Renaissance. Scholars, theologians, and historians place the start of the Renaissance in the late 1300s, which corresponds exactly with Daniel's 1290 years added to 70 A.D., coming to the date of 1360 A.D. Some historians link the start of the Renaissance to the period immediately after the outbreak of the bubonic plague called Black Death in Florence, Italy in about 1347 A.D. A Wikipedia article about this plague states, the Black Death was present in the Italian states of present-day Italy between 1347 and 1348. Sicily and the Italian peninsula was the first area in then Catholic Western Europe to be reached by the bubonic plague pandemic known as the Black Death, which reached the region by an Italian ship from the Crimea, which landed in Messina in Sicily in October 1347. Close quote. Thus we see that when the floodwaters of the Great Apostasy were at their absolute high point in 1360 AD, according to Daniel's timeline, human suffering was at a very low point as millions of people died from the Black Death, as recounted by Gordon B. Hinckley, who said, "Ignorance and evil enveloped the world, resulting in what is known as the Dark Ages. The Black Death killed some 50 million people during the 14th century." Close quote. Elder Neal A. Maxwell adds this insight, saying, "The readers, for instance, of Barbara Tuchman's highly researched book about the 14th century will note how that century included several plagues of Black Death. In just one of these visitations, death took 1 in 3 of all mortals living between Iceland and India." Close quote. George Reynolds adds this final comment about the death and suffering during this time of the bubonic plague or Black Death, saying, "We know that during the 14th century, Black Death carried off 25 million people in Europe and almost as many in China and other parts of Asia." Close quote. At this low point in human suffering during the height of spiritual darkness in the world, the Jews were made the scapegoat. They were blamed for the Black Plague and were severely persecuted and oppressed again, as they had been since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Ezra Taft Benson explains this latest oppression of the Jews, saying, "Scarcely 8,000 Jews were left in all of Palestine after 70 AD, and even their banishment and scattering didn't end their persecution. Efforts were made to drive them from various countries. Some nations made an effort to banish them completely. They were accused of causing the Black Death that spread through Europe in 1348, and many Jews were crucified therefore." Close quote. The history of the Black Death that I've recounted for you gives meaning to the second obscure date that we find in Daniel chapter 12, verse 12, which I mentioned before, and which I will quote for you now, saying, "Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,305 days." Close quote. The 1,335 days of years, or 45 additional years that follow Daniel's 1,290 years, remain a mystery to most. It stands to reason that the 45 extra years cannot be understood if the 1,290 years remain misunderstood. What is clear, however, is the blessing promised to those that live in this age beyond the 1,290 years that ended with the Black Death in the late 1300s, and what Daniel described as specifically the year 1360 AD. That is, a blessing awaited the Jews that survived the Black Death. Without identifying the historical context as such, Albert Barnes said, "Blessed is he that waiteth." This indicates a patient expectation of an event that was to occur and the happy state of him who would reach it. The angel refers to another period different from the time and times and a half, and different also from the 1,290 days. He speaks of this as the consummation, as the desirable time, and pronounces him blessed who shall be permitted to see it. The idea here is that of one looking out for this as a happy period, and that he would be regarded as a happy man who should live in that age. Close quote. With these thoughts in mind, let's consider how the 1,335 days of years also run from 70 AD to arrive at the year 1405 AD. Daniel 12:12 predicted blessings upon the Jews that survived the Black Death and lived to see the year 1405 AD during the Renaissance, as explained by Kyle and Delitzsch, saying, since all interpreters rightly understand that the 1290 and 1335 days have the same terminus a quo, that is 70 AD, and thus that the 1290 days are comprehended in the 1335, the latter period extending beyond the former by only 45 days, then the oppression cannot properly last longer than 1290 days if he who reaches to the 1335 days is to be regarded as blessed. Close quote. Blessing, of course, is a little bit of a relative term in this context. Daniel 12:12 means that Jewish survivors of the Black Plague were blessed at the turn of the 15th century when compared to their desolate and persecuted condition at the time of the Black Plague 45 years earlier. This does not mean that all Jewish persecution ceased. They will never cease before the second coming of Jesus Christ, as predicted in the 70 weeks prophecy. However, Daniel predicted a blessing on the Jews as the Dark Ages came to an end and the Renaissance began. History again shows the accuracy of Daniel's prediction. The increasing light of the Renaissance in the late 1300s and early into the 1400s led to cultural and social reforms as well as religious freedoms, which Bruce R. McConkie described, saying, there comes a time when the chains of darkness can no longer shackle the free spirit of those whose Father is God. The Renaissance spread throughout Europe and resulted in achieving freedom from the intellectual bondage to which the individual man had been subjected by the theology and hierarchy of the church. The Renaissance insisted upon the rights of the life that now is and dignified the total sphere for which man's intellect and his aesthetic and social tastes by nature fit him. Close quote. Victor L. Ludlow explains the effects of the Renaissance further, saying, the Renaissance revival of classical learning and its attendant attitudes of questioning and searching prompted some people to reevaluate the religious beliefs and practices of the time. The publication and circulation of new ideas stimulated discussion and debate and led to an atmosphere where religious doctrines could be questioned. Close quote. The reforms just spoken about were a blessing to the Jews and eased their afflictions as they continued to maintain their cultural and religious separation from other people. Joseph Fielding Smith explains the miracle of their separate existence after so many years of persecutions and threats against them, saying, the destruction predicted by our Lord fell upon Jerusalem and the Jews in the year 70 AD. And the Jews were scattered all over the face of the earth. They have been persecuted, murdered, driven, abused, and hated by all peoples, and yet they have prospered in material things, and they have maintained their identity as a race, which is a marvelous miracle. Close quote. Centuries of spiritual darkness were dispelled in the 45 years between 1360 and 1405 AD, as the floodwaters of apostasy receded from the earth. This occurred as the light of Christ began to illuminate the earth in greater measures. Bruce R. McConkie described this transformation from spiritual darkness to spiritual light during the Renaissance, saying, we know that Christ in his day brought the bright light of the glorious gospel, that thereafter there was darkness, pure truths were twisted into evil heresies, godly conduct degenerated into carnal lewdness. Then came the Renaissance, as the light of Christ refreshed the consciences of men, as art and architecture and learning were born anew, as science and a search for truth outside the creeds found place in the heart of men. Close quote. Spiritual darkness fled from the light of the rising sun of spiritual illumination. This was a time of spiritual rebirth. The spiritual light of the Renaissance was the foundation for the Reformation that began in earnest early in the 1500s, as Gordon B. Hinckley explained, saying that somehow in that long season of darkness a candle was lighted. The age of Renaissance brought with it a flowering of learning, art, and science. There came a moment of bold and courageous men and women who looked heavenward in acknowledgement of God and his divine Son. We speak of it as the Reformation." Close quote. The Reformation paved the way for the full gospel light in the 1800s. Bruce R. McConkie described this process of going from complete spiritual darkness to the spiritual enlightenment of the latter days, saying, "During the 16th century, as the Reformation grew out of the Renaissance as a means of breaking the hold of the dominant church, the great Christian reformers lit a new doctrinal fire. That fire, burning wildly over the dry and arid prairies of religious autocracy, is what really prepared the way for the restoration of the gospel in modern times." Close quote. Donald W. Perry adds that the restoration did not spring forth from the earth without preparation. The Lord brought the earth from darkness to light through the age of the Renaissance and the Reformation, and then prepared a land of freedom where the gospel seed could be planted and could grow. Close quote. The restoration of full gospel light in 1830 ended the flood of darkness called the Great Apostasy, but that end came gradually as the light of Christ increasingly dispelled darkness for almost 500 years during the Renaissance and Reformation, just as Daniel predicted when he saw the flood of spiritual darkness rising in the earth for 1290 years until 1360 A.D. After the floodwaters of spiritual darkness crested in 1360 or reached their high point, the light of Christ increased and the spiritual darkness of the dark ages dissipated in the same way that waters recede after a great flood. Even though the Great Apostasy ended with the restoration of the gospel, the Jews remain in a collective state of apostasy that will continue throughout the 12,000-year gap of time in Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, as I discussed in my podcast from July 8, 2025. The light of the gospel will not go to the Jews as a people and nation until after the Gentiles, that is, non-Jews, receive the gospel on a preferential basis during the times of the Gentiles. Bruce R. McConkie explains the meaning of the times of the Gentiles, saying, "The times of the Gentiles is that time or era, that expanse of time or years, during which the gospel goes to the Gentiles on a preferential basis. In Jesus' day, the gospel was offered first to his Jewish kinsmen. Only later was it preached in Gentile ears. In our day, it has been restored to the Gentiles, meaning to the non-Jewish people, however, who are of the house of Israel. It is now being taught on a preferential basis to Gentiles or non-Jewish people, for, as Paul said, blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in," quoting Romans 11:25. The restoration of the gospel foreshadows the end of the Gentile era and the ushering in of the Jewish era. Close quote. The times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled at the second coming, and the gospel will then go to the Jews as a receptive people who are no longer blinded by the apostasy of their fathers. Gerald Lund spoke of this event, saying, "The Savior, when speaking to his disciples of his second coming and the establishment of his kingdom on the earth, said, the Jews should be scattered and trodden under foot until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. But, said he, when you see the light breaking forth among the Gentiles," referring to the preaching of his gospel amongst them, When you see salvation offered to the Gentiles and the Jews, the seed of Israel, pass by, the last first and the first last, when you see this, you may know that the time of my second coming is at hand, as surely as you know that summer is nigh, when the fig tree puts forth its leaves. And when these things commence, that generation shall not pass away until all are fulfilled. Close quote. There will, of course, be isolated cases of Jewish conversions before the day of the second coming. In general, however, the night of spiritual slumber will continue among the Jews, together with the desolations that afflict them until the second coming, as I have discussed in connection with my podcasts dealing with the 70 weeks prophecy, including specifically the 70th week of 7 years in that prophecy that I will be discussing in my next podcast. So until then, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing, and to Jen and Kristen for all their technical help. I'll see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.